Hello everyone, welcome to Interview with the Masters. Today we have Dzu Nguyen. He is teaching the environment class. Unfortunately his class is full now, so it'll only be available next time. This week, this registration is called Foundational. We're focusing on Foundational. It's the last week to register for classes. So any class, there's still a few classes open. Just double check on the website. And without further ado, I will hand it off to Dzu.
Hi everyone. Thanks for coming out for my interview. I know it's a Saturday, but glad to be here. Happy to share some of my experience and knowledge with you guys. If you have any questions, just go ahead and ask Jonathan. I like to run an informal interview / Q&A. However you guys need me to be of service to you, I'm more than willing to answer any of your questions. So let me tell you a little bit about myself in case you're not familiar with me. I am a senior concept artist at Sony San Diego. I have been in the industry since 2005, I believe. I've worked on a couple titles, one of which was PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale. I've also worked on Destiny of Spirits, Sorcery, Resistance, Burning Skies, and a bunch of other freelance projects. And I work mostly in the video game industry, although I have done storyboarding and illustration. My background is originally in electrical engineering, and several years ago, roughly around 2002, I decided to make a career change, and now after a lot of trial and error and a lot of effort and taking classes and just learning on my own, I'm working in the entertainment industry now. So that's pretty much my background in a nutshell. Let me show you some of my work, professional and personal. Sorry, I had to make sure that we could see this full screen.
Yeah, it looks good.
Does it? Okay. So these are some of my my works that I'm showing you guys today. And if you have any questions, just let me know. I use the same approach for all these as what I teach in the class, environment sketching. I'm also teaching dynamic sketching 1 this term as well. So I don't just do environments. I do a combination of environments, characters, weapons, vehicles, things like that. I do a little bit of everything. If you have any questions about process, my process is pretty much the same. Figure out what the story is, come up with a solution for the problems that you're going to have when you're drawing or painting this or whatever the design might be, and then just apply that in an efficient manner and iterate on your ideas. Very rarely will I get the idea the first time, and so it's a lot of trial and error and a lot of iteration and a lot of just reviewing with my art director, my clients, or if it's a personal piece, just trying to go for the mood and the feeling, right? Some of these are looser than others, and it just depends on what I was trying to communicate at the time. So now a lot of these are inspired by different ideas that I've seen just from reading or news stories, movies and games, things like that. And I'll just take that idea and I'll put my own twist or my own spin on it. So these are mostly personal pieces so far. You can kind of see I like to do landscapes that are a little bit different but still have a sense of believability. I like to think of it as traveling. I would like to travel to these places, whether they're scary or fun or interesting or unique or historical, whatever that feeling is. I try to capture that and I try to experience it as I'm creating the piece. And if you can get that experience and get that emotion into your artwork, then it'll come out when the viewer looks at it, right?
Do you have any tips on putting yourself in that state or having that feeling?
Yeah, I try to visualize myself like in this world, and I try to think of it as if I were visiting it like a tourist. What's the emotion that I want to feel, you know? And when we're dealing with emotion and putting emotion into our stories, into our images, you have to think about just in terms of very basic, simple words. Nothing, you know, convoluted. I try to start with a one-sentence story that maybe captures some of the emotion, like this piece right here. This was done for a steampunk show up at Cal State Fullerton, where I got my master's, and this was a part of an illustration for the book Anubis Gates. And there's a scene in the book where it's kind of a tense moment, and I want to capture kind of a spooky feeling, somewhat you know, dark, but at the same time not like really, really threatening, but just a little spooky, a little bit mysterious. And so that's why I chose these particular colors. That's why I chose the fog and the atmosphere that I'm trying to communicate. And it all kind of started from that keyword of spooky, right? And what about these types of scenes would invoke that? And you try to impart as much as you can into those feelings and those emotions. You know, this was also done for that same show. Another part of the book where it's like under the sewers in the like Victorian era England. So, you know, this one was like underground, under a cave, and I just thought, what about the scale of this? What if there was this mysterious sewer system that was really large in comparison to the characters? And I like to think epic or big or sense of scale with these types of things. I want to capture that, like these things tower over us. I want to get a sense that we're smaller and we're like dwarfed by these large sewers. And so that emotion is what I'm trying to get into the image. Especially if I was like standing in that scene, what would it look like, right? And a lot of that I draw upon just my own love of travel and where I've gone to and how did I feel when I was there. Like looking at the Colosseum, you know, I tap into that same emotion when I was looking at the Colosseum in Rome and try to have that same emotion in this same image. And so that's why it's really good to go out and experience the world and not just stay in your room and draw all day, but to go out there and experience it so you can feel it. And then once you capture that emotion, you remember based on your own firsthand experience, and then you can find a way to impart that into your own work. So that's kind of the best way that I found how to do it. There are other ways, and everybody's a little bit different, but I like to think of it as just traveling, as if I'm visiting this place for the first time. What mood, what emotion am I trying to experience?
Right.
Yeah. This was a professional piece, for Resistance Burning Skies. Some of the work is in black and white, some of it's in color. I have a lot of different approaches, and that's something that I teach in the class. Even though it's environment sketching and we don't get to color, but I do teach line work as well as just value painting because I think both are really important. They provide two different approaches to tackle the same problem essentially, and sometimes you want different approaches to either free up your imagination or come up with different shapes and different approaches to attack the problem from different angles. And so a lot of times I'll draw upon one or the other, or sometimes even both if I'm having trouble trying to solve a visual problem. I'll approach it from different angles until I find the best solution for it. So I do characters as well. This is just orthographics. I didn't model this. This was the original model that they gave us. This was for PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale. So you can see the 3D model, and then we did different costume paint-overs and renderings and things like that for the characters. So, as well as, you know, material call-out sheet. Very important, very handy. A lot of times if you don't have time to paint it all out, you can just do a line sketch with some flat colors and put in some material call-outs to tell the 3D modelers, you know, what the material is or what it's actually supposed to be. So this was for an art show up in Seattle for the art of the video game. This is my own take for Left 4 Dead, but in San Diego. So this is the Coronado Bay Bridge right here. and what it would look like in the zombie apocalypse. So, just taking an idea, putting your own spin on it. And I like to do a variety as well. There's, fantasy and sci-fi, but also realistic. So having that flexibility is important. And then also being able to use photo textures, but also paint it as if it were just oil paint or gouache or watercolor. Just having that variety of solutions for both speed and efficiency, as well as communicating your ideas. So some character work. This was for Destiny of Spirits. Being able to play that, there were different heroes and creatures from around the world, from mythology and things like that. And so we had to come up with different art styles to represent these creatures. So this is my take on Cthulhu based off of some descriptions given to us by the client.
Mm-hmm.
So here's more of a painterly approach, right? And then here's more line and some flat color, because the styles dictated that we do it in different ways. So again, having that flexibility to do both.
Mm-hmm.
Oops. More from the same project, Destiny of Spirits. So again, switching back to flat colors here, with a little bit of gradation just to indicate form, but then also more contrast and stronger lighting, again to emulate a particular style or a particular look.
Mm-hmm. When you mention different art styles, how do you decide or figure out a style that's usable?
It depends on if it's for your own work or if it's for a client. If it's for a client or a project, usually they will tell you what the style is. Sometimes as a concept artist, you have to come up with a style. Does the style fit the mood of the project? Does the style fit the demographic? If it's for kids or is it for adults? There's a huge difference between, say, Fat Princess and Call of Duty, right? So it depends on the studio you're working at. It depends on the project. And sometimes you have to have the flexibility to do both, and that's going to be dictated by the project itself. And sometimes higher-ups will tell you what the style is going to be. Sometimes you have to develop it. When it's for your own personal work, I'm of the opinion that your style evolves over time, and it evolves based on your references and your preferences. So reference as in the things that you like to look at for reference, like other concept artists, movies, games, comic books, things like that. And preferences as in who are your favorite artists? What is their style? If you pick, say, your top 5 favorite artists, their style will come out in your own work because there's something in their work that you like, and it might just be how they draw heads. It could be how they render metal and materials or hard surfaces. It could be their brushwork. But your style is going to be kind of an evolution or a cocktail of your references. And so it has to evolve over time, though. It's not something where you just sit down and say, I'm going to change my style, right? It's based off of everything you've seen and everything that you've drawn or painted up to this point. So that's pretty much how, for me, style has evolved. And sometimes if you're doing a lot of professional work that's more painterly, for example, it creeps into your own personal work, and then you can make a conscious choice to switch. So if I've been doing a lot of line work at work, I might switch over to more painterly style of working. And that way it's just to balance itself out and keep it fresh and exciting for me. And then that painterly approach will kind of creep into my work at work as well. So it all kind of feeds on itself. And the biggest thing, though, is your reference. How do you like to work, and who are the artists that you like to look at, and that will come out in your own work over time. So here's some more projects that were a little looser, more like environment sketching. Honestly, some of these were done in 2 to 3 hours, the looseness. It was more to capture a mood and a feeling. Mm-hmm. And you can kind of see, like, this was more of a epic establishing shot to show the environment. Then this was more street level to get a sense and feel for the lighting and the mood. And then in the same world, but in a different part of the world, there's something like this where it's so diametrically opposed in terms of mood and feel that you know, you're telling a story about that location, and that's really what environment sketching and environment design and painting is all about, is telling a story of that environment. You know, the lighting, the weather, the atmosphere, the shapes, the architecture, that kind of a thing. So.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of these were quick because they just wanted mood pieces. This one was for Resistance Burning Skies. This was a lot more work because of all the photo texturing. Had to have more detail so that somebody could model this. So the difference would be this is maybe 3 to 4 hours of work, and then this one is maybe 30 hours of work. And a lot of it is just trying to get the right lighting, the details more specific, you know, cleaning things up, making sure that it meets and satisfies the client's needs, that type of a thing. So some more work for PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale. Again, coming up with the rendering for it, and then material callouts. It's a little small. Sorry about that. I'll see if I can find that later, but just, you know, like a spaceport, kind of epic, kind of large scale. Yeah, that's much in my work.
How long do you spend on these value black and white kind of paintings?
2 to 3 hours maximum, and these are more finished black and whites, I would say, and there's some looser ones that I can show you that don't take nearly as long, but it's more to iterate and come up with different ideas. And a lot of the times, you know, those things maybe take an hour.
Okay.
So here's like a page of them, here's, for example. And so you can see if let's say I'm designing one location, I might come up with, say, 9 different camera angles, 9 different moods, 9 different lighting situations for that one area, and these are all done pretty quickly. I would say they're maybe about this big, right? When I sketch them out, you can see it when I zoom in how loose they are. And what I'm trying to do is just capture the lighting, capture the feel of it, and then once I have one that I like, then I can go back in and render it and polish it off a little bit more. But usually these are maybe 30 minutes to an hour at most. Like this one was really fast because it's more organic and it's more just shapes really and atmosphere. This one, this bottom middle one, it has a little bit more perspective to it and some more hard shapes because it's architecture. So this one took a little bit longer, but this one was probably about an hour. And some of these other ones are much faster. So I like to have a process that I can rely upon to deliver consistent results. And part of that is going through your iterations, right? Starting from the big stuff first, working your way into the details. So small thumbnails, and then like a more detailed black and white sketch. And then if the black and white sketch is working, I'll add color to it. And then, you know, photo textures for details and things like that. But I usually go in that sequence so that if I have to make any changes, I haven't wasted like 8 hours or 10 hours on something, right? It's important that I get feedback from my client or my art director, or even for myself. You know, if I'm not feeling a painting, I don't want to spend 5 hours working straight into color if I could have solved it in the sketch phase or in the black and white sketch phase even. So.
Right.
Yeah.
Are there any techniques or tips to picking up speed in your painting process?
Yeah, one thing that I like to do in terms of like Photoshop stuff, and I can maybe jump into a quick little demo here, just some of my Photoshop techniques that I like to use. First is I always just, you know, don't paint on this background layer. I'll create a new layer on top of it. And then if I'm painting, let's say this is my composition, I tend to start with either the Lasso Tool or a hard brush. Like right now I have all these things set up on it, But I find that it's a little bit better to just start with some simple shapes, and I might just start with, three values in the beginning, especially if I'm working with tone. I just start with the 3 values and just have the shapes kind of blocked in. And then once I have a shape that I like, let's say there's like this large tower in the foreground that I want to design. Oops. I focus on the shape first, right? And if that means I have to draw and figure out what the shape is with line and then fill in the tones, then I'll do that. Because a lot of times silhouettes and blocking things in with paint, it gets you some of the read on it, but it doesn't help you with the overall design, right? Especially on the interior of it or the form. So let's say I just have a shape that I kind of like. This is on, actually let's do this. Usually this will be on its own layer. And then the actual composition and the background will be on a separate layer. So that what I can do is I'll work modularly. So if this is my shape, then I'll just create another layer on top of it. And I'll hold down Alt. And if you can see, the hand turns into those 2 circles or that little triangle. What I'm doing is I'm linking this layer above it. So when I need to put photo textures or other colors or whatever, like let's say I wanted to make this blue, right? I'm painting on this layer, but because it's linked to layer 1, which is the black silhouette shape underneath, it only paints on the inside of that. So what that means is I can go ahead and really design this shape out to my heart's content until I like exactly how it looks, clean it up, and not have to worry about cleaning up all this. If I didn't have this layer, what would happen would be, I would have to go back in and clean everything up every time I wanted to work and re-change that shape. And what this does also is if, let's say I'm working on this and my art director says, oh, that object or that building is too small, like let's say here's my composition, and they want me to increase that size, then when this is linked to it, I can just grab this one and increase the size of it, and then just move this whole thing over. And I don't have to repaint the whole thing, right? And I can link all the textures and all the paint strokes and even change the lighting on this too. Use, let's say, a multiply layer and just focus on kind of painting in the light and the shadow side really quickly, and I don't have to worry so much about doing too many things at once, right? I tackle the problems one at a time, and what this does is it allows me to just focus, and then once I get, let's say, the light and the shadow on this, I can go back in on another layer, let's say with color dodge. Oops. And add some light to it. Just using a softer airbrush right here, just to get like a subtle gradation on it. You can even use the Lasso Tool as well. I use the Lasso Tool a lot, just to get kind of some of those hard edges. It doesn't have to be perfect since I have everything linked to this bottom layer. I just go back in here and paint in my gradations. And then just repeat that on its own layer, thinking about where the light's coming in from. And now everything's on its own layer. I don't have to worry about cleaning it up that much, right? I've got the silhouette, I've got the form built up. and I can just kind of have fun with the shape and the painting part of it. So using the linked layers, it helps speed things up quite a bit. Also using the adjustment layers right here. I use curves a lot if I wanted to, say, manipulate all of this. I'll link it to everything else, and I can push the contrast a little bit more. You know, I can do all sorts of things non-destructively. So if I start painting this and maybe this area starts getting too muddy, you know, I can always just adjust the values right here. I can make corrections with color as well. Rather than having to repaint this whole thing, I could just use another color adjustment layer, say hue saturation, and then just move some of these sliders around. And then if it's, right now it's not linked to that particular layer, it's happening globally, so if I link it, then it's just affecting whatever this layer 1 was, which is my original silhouette, right? So I can manipulate this one section of the painting and adjust the colors and tweak it. And so usually what I'll do is I'll have a hierarchy of, say, foreground objects, middle ground objects, background objects, and anything that's really important, like my focal point, will be on separate layers, and I can manipulate them like this, and then just worry about painting very loosely on the interior. So those are some of the techniques that I use, you know, and then using photo manipulation and photo bashing to get some of the details. Like if I wanted to put a lot of industrial type stuff, I could paint it, but if I could just get a photo and indicate some of that that detail, then I will, just to save on time. And I'll, again, since it's all linked to this one silhouette, just like this color layer is linked to it, I can just put that photo texture right on top, and it won't go outside the lines, essentially. So, so that's how I quickly get these sketches out, just using a few Photoshop techniques, and then just the foundation and the basics, perspective, drawing, value. I don't really worry about brushwork as much because we're just trying to get the idea out and communicate that idea as quickly as possible. So yeah, that's stuff that I teach in my environment sketching class as well. We go through a progression with line work, and then I show you these techniques once we get into the value stages. A lot of times my thumbnails are really loose and scribbly, you know. They don't really look like anything at all. And unless I'm showing them to a client, I might just start off with some basic, you know, perspective grid to get kind of an idea of what I want to draw, because it's just to generate the ideas. And then maybe on a separate layer I'll come in here, so I can use this perspective grid later on. I can just copy the whole thing and then just sketch in some shapes. You know, and here I'm just focusing on the composition and thinking about what the idea is going to be. And it doesn't even have to be a perfect drawing or anything like that. It's just more about the placement of stuff and how I'm going to break down the space. Composition, where do I have my focal point? What's my foreground elements to help frame the action? What's my background element going to be? How do I show scale? Things like that. So, maybe some indications of details, but a lot of times my sketches will just be really loose like this, and it's enough to give me kind of an idea of what it is that I'm going to be doing later on. Or if the composition's working, I haven't wasted more than like a minute sketching this out, then I could always just copy it and transfer it around, squash and stretch. Could even flip and rotate it. You know, anything to kind of come up with interesting shapes, interesting ideas. And I'll just kind of build off of that same idea. And then a lot of the times when, you know, in my environment sketching class, I emphasize coming up with your own ideas, right? And how do you generate your ideas and have that confidence in your work? And a lot of it is, you know, starting loosely like this and trying to find your own visual language so that when you're drawing, You're drawing upon your own visual vocabulary and the things you've seen, the things that you've observed and studied, and then drawing upon that and coming up with a compelling story on your own so that it's not just another generic sci-fi scene or fantasy scene, right? But has a little bit more character to it, a little bit more personality, and a little bit more of you. So here I'm just kind of blocking some stuff in, looking at the composition, thinking about what my focal point might be, things like that. Whereas on this one, it's kind of like the opposite. That would be a foreground element. This might be, like, say, a midground. This would be midground, and then back here would be my background elements, and it might just be more shapes than anything else. Maybe even making this whole thing my foreground element. Again, kind of framing the action right in there as my focal point. How many different ways can we lead the viewers' eye into here and figure out what our story is. So yeah, from here, you have the shape, and I would just use this approach where I kind of block it in and figure out what the design of that shape is. And the shape itself can come from a variety of sources. You can be inspired by a plant, you can be inspired by a car or a motorcycle, you can be inspired by anything, really. And that inspiration is what's going to make your building different than my building, right? Because we all gather our own reference, we all have our own preferences, and that's how you add your own unique twist on things. So if we have to do a castle, let's say, and we all look at different references and get inspired by it and develop our own shape language from our reference, then when we come in and design out that castle, we're going to draw upon a different set of shapes, a different set of materials, a different idea. And also tying it in with the emotion that we talked about earlier. What's the feeling that you want in this scene? Right? What's the mood that you want? What's the time of day? What do you want the viewer to feel? The viewer has to feel something. If they don't feel something, then they're not going to want to stick around and get lost in your details and look at all the fun stuff that you painstakingly put in there. So yeah, it's a little bit about my process and some of the stuff that I do.
At what point do you incorporate reference, or how do you use, what's your philosophy or process on reference?
For me, I use reference in a couple different ways. And that's a good question because not everybody uses reference the same way. So the first thing I'll do is I'll use reference to build up my visual vocabulary for a project. Right? So that'll be the first thing. Sometimes I'll just spend a day gathering reference for a particular project, especially if I'm not familiar with it. I'll just gather reference. I'll spend half a day maybe to a full day, depending on how big the project is, and I'll just look at reference and get inspired by shapes and locales and lighting and things like that. And that's just for me to absorb as much as I can. And this will just be looking and gathering. And then part of developing that, the next step for that, would be to sketch from it, sketch some of those shapes. Right? Like if I've never drawn trees before, I'll get a lot of reference by just gathering it off of either online or Google, Pinterest, Tumblr, whatever. My own photos, I have a lot of photo reference that I use, which is different than anyone else's, so that's really good. But then I'll actually sketch from that reference. It's not enough to just have it. You have to sketch from it and learn it and do like shape language breakdowns and figure out how that tree is put together, what makes it unique, right? Come up with that shape language. And this is during the study phase, really. I haven't even started sketching anything up here. It's just to study. And this is to build up your visual vocabulary, your database in your head, so that when you draw and sketch from your imagination, that stuff is already up there in your memory. And if you're having trouble drawing things, it's because your visual vocabulary is not developed enough. You haven't done enough gathering and observation, and you haven't done enough sketching from that material. So that's like all in the pre-production phase, really, right? And then once I start to draw and sketch things out, drawing upon my visual vocabulary, I'll have that reference up in Photoshop or off on a second monitor, and I'll refer to it as much as I need to for like details and things like that, and shapes, things that might inspire me. Out of like, let's say, hundreds of images that I'll gather here, I might pick maybe 10 to 20 images that really are at the core of the product or the painting that I'm working on. And this could be lighting, it could be shapes, materials, textures, details, whatever. But like 10 to 20 of them, so you're narrowing it down to get the essence of what that is. And I'll use this in my painting. I'll have it right up next to me. And I'll refer back to it. So this is during like the painting stage, not so much the studying stage. And that's kind of how I use my reference. But the really important part is this phase up here. Most people kind of skip this. Mm-hmm. They gather their reference, or they don't use reference at all, and they'll just paint from their imagination, and they'll get frustrated when all their buildings or their houses kind of look like, like this, right? Like, why do all my buildings look like this? Because this generic building that everybody and every kindergartner learned how to draw. And what we need to do is come up with more interesting shapes that could represent a house or a commercial building, and that takes a lot of observation and sketching of architecture and time periods and cultures and things like that. And that way you get away from the generic and you work your way towards the specific, right? When we start off, we're all kind of doing generic stuff based off of our references and influences. What we need to do is get specific with it. Mm. That's where the reference comes in, right? Like you have to do steampunk. Well, you have to gather reference for it. Otherwise, your version of steampunk is going to be like everybody else's version of steampunk.
Right.
Doing a fantasy castle, you have to be specific. What type of castle? What time period? What is it European? If it's European, is it French? Is it German? Is it Swiss? If it's German, which era? What materials? And then how can you put a twist to it so it's not just strict fantasy or strict realistic, but more fantasy? What's the difference between fantasy and realistic? So there's all these things that we need to account for, and if you don't have that visual vocabulary to draw upon, then there's no way you're going to be able to invent it. So that's why reference is so important. I use this a lot, and I think when I teach the class, the number one issue that a lot of the students have is they just don't have that reference library either collected on their hard drive somewhere or just memorized through a lot of sketching. It's kind of like when you're learning a vocabulary word, you're learning how to spell, and you had to write out the word, encyclopedia like 50 times until you just remembered how to spell it. You're doing the same thing when you're sketching. You're imparting that information into your memory based on your observation. So yeah, that's how I use a reference. Hopefully that helps you guys in preparation for all your other classes as well. Not just environments, but like characters. You should be studying costumes. You should be studying fashion. You should be studying historical time periods and things like that, because you never know when you have to draw upon it or combine, say, 20th century fashion with Japanese samurai armor, right, to make a different futuristic style or something like that. So, yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah. How do you decide which direction the light comes from? I guess in regards to those thumbnails that you were doing.
Oh, yeah. So when it comes to lighting, get a fresh sheet here. Actually, you know what? I can do it right on here. When it comes to lighting, there are a couple things that we need to think about, right? With lighting, you have to be consistent with it. Without that consistency, your viewer is not going to believe what it is that you're trying to tell them. So you have to be consistent with the logic of lighting. So you need to know the direction of the light. And I would start with 1. You don't need to worry about too many fancy bounce lights and things like that at first. Think about the main directional light source. Is it coming from, like let's say this is my line sketch. I might try 4 or 5 different lighting situations based upon the mood that I want. Think about time of day as well. Time of day, and then also mood. For help on this, if you're not familiar with it, you can obviously look at photos, but I like to look at cinematography as well, because they're trying to communicate an idea and tell a story and impart a mood at the same time, right? So look at cinematography, look at some of your favorite directors and some of your favorite movies, and do some studies, do some quick studies to kind of learn the lighting and the temperature and things like that. But the first thing is the direction. So what I'll do is I'll come up with 3 or 4 different directional lights. So like maybe the light's coming from, let's say, the top right. So maybe the light's coming in from this direction. And then maybe I'll do another thumbnail where the light's coming from directly above. Maybe another one where the light's coming from below. Right? So in the same scene, I'll still use like curves, hue, saturation, and my layers to paint and change those light schemes using value alone until I get the right one. So the first is the direction. You have to be consistent with it. The second one, oops, this is not working. Once you have the direction, you have to think about how strong is that light. Is it like a direct sunlight, right? Or is it a spotlight if it's not a natural light? Is it a spotlight that's really strong? Is it diffused, where it's like maybe an overcast day or a cloudy day? Or is it, you know, like the bat signal or something like that, right? That's illuminating a very specific area. And again, these will give you different levels of contrast, which will affect the mood as well. And then, you know, step 3, sorry about this, is the fall off of light. And this is going to be dependent upon the strength of the light. Really strong lights like the sun, you know, it's going to blast the entire planet, right? Whereas if you just have one little light bulb, there's going to be drastic fall off the farther away you get from it. And so you're going to have less intensity of the light. And so this is what I mean by you have to be consistent. So when I start to paint this scene, let's say the light is that red light coming in from the top right. Everything that's facing, since this is top right, that means everything that's going to be in shadow is going to be facing down, or the bottom planes, and to the left. So you just need to make sure that all your shadows are going to be facing either the bottom plane, like this bridge right here, or to the left, which would be, say, the side of this building. And you just make sure that you're consistent all the way through. Everything facing down and to the left. So these 3 planes are facing to the left. They're going to get like, this is the bottom plane, going to be in shadow. Here's the left side, let's say. This side is facing up and towards the right, so it's going to be in light. This is facing away from the light. And then you could have like the light side, the shadow side, reflected light, and things like that. But you need to make sure that you get the big overall picture first before you tackle any of that other stuff. Let's say there's another one over here. And then we have cast shadows on the ground, so there could be a cast shadow here. There's probably a cast shadow on this one. Then there's probably a cast shadow on this thing, but it's, you know, off the page, right? There's probably a cast shadow on this building, so this light's coming in, it's going to hit here. So this side is going to be the cast shadow from this building on the right. And then everything that's facing up and to the right would catch light. And then, you know, intensity in the planes and the form of these buildings themselves will dictate where that light hits it. And then I would do the same thing for this one up here, which is blue, right? So the light's coming from the top, which means the shadow side is going to be everything facing down. Now I would do a separate thumbnail with that same line drawing to show the lighting situation for that same scene. Then here with that green light, which is coming from the bottom, the logic says that the shadow will be everything facing up for the top plane. And so that's what I mean by consistent. If you start to change the side that has the shadow, then the viewer is going to be confused, right? It's not going to read properly. So as long as you're consistent with it and you just start with the big stuff first and then go ahead and put in the bounce light, like there's probably a lot of bounce light here, but as long as this stays the main shadow side, then you'll get the effect of the light, because we're not actually painting in the light unless we have God rays. So what we're trying to do is paint the shadows. And then by painting the shadows, you are going to imply the direction of the light. And so that's how I do the light. And I usually do that with just the curves tool and the adjustment layers like I did here. And what that does is I can do all these different lighting scenarios with just a couple of light layers, and then I preserve my painting underneath. I don't have to keep painting and repainting it every time I want to change the lighting or change the color scheme. And then with lighting also, I didn't include color because it's mostly black and white here, but when it comes to light, when you're working color, you have to also consider the temperature of the light as well, the color of the light overall. So step 4 would be color temperature. Is it warm? Is it cool? You know, sunlight is a warm light, but if it's overcast or diffused, it's going to be a cooler light, that kind of a thing. So that's kind of a quick rundown on lighting and how I approach it. Sorry, my notes are a little jumbled together. Trying to fit it all on one page so you guys can see it all. Yeah. Good questions, though.
Cool.
Any other questions?
Yes. Question about freelance. When you work freelance, where did you find a job and how much did you charge?
That's a good question. I get asked that all the time. You know, freelance is one of those funny things. You can get freelance from anywhere, really. When I first started out, and this was before a lot of social media. This was before a lot of YouTube videos even. There was concept art, and I used that website to post up my portfolio, and I would look for work in those message boards because sometimes you know, companies or clients would, you know, have a little advertisement looking for artists for this project or that project, and then I would just apply for those. Sometimes when I posted up my portfolio saying I was available for work, I would get contacted by people. I would say about 80% of those people were looking for free work, which I would suggest you guys not do. You know, and that kind of ties in with how much do you want to charge for work. You know, there are a couple thoughts about this. You know, on the one hand, you want to make sure that you're making a decent amount of money for this, but you have to temper that with your skill level. You know, how good are you? How much experience do you have? Are you first starting out? Does the company have a big budget? Is it a big company, or is it like somebody who wants to make their own personal project that's willing to give you a couple $100 here and there? How long is it going to take you? You know, you kind of have to factor all of those things in. You know, in the beginning, when you're first starting out with freelance, you can't assume that you're going to be making a living at it. You just have to use it almost like supplementary income and keep your day job or find just a regular job to pay the bills. But continue to pursue your freelance opportunities until that point occurs where you're making enough just doing freelance in comparison to, say, a regular 9-to-5 job at a coffee shop or something like that. So, I mean, there's so many factors. And plus, it depends on your location, your geographical location as well, and your client's geographical location. I wish I could give a more concrete answer, but there's so many variables, especially now with a global market. One of the projects that I've worked on, the company, actually the guy who was trying to start off his own company was in France, and I was in the United States, in San Diego, California. And so there was a time difference, but we did all of the contact through email. And, you know, his business practices were different than my business practices. You know, he would wire me money orders to pay me as opposed to like PayPal or checks. There was also the conversion rate. So I had to calculate how long would it take me to do one piece, how many pieces did he want, and how much was I comfortable with, like, let's say at the very base level, how much do you want to make per hour, right? I would honestly say don't go less than $20 an hour because depending on where you're living, you have to factor in for taxes, you know, advertisement, supplies, materials, depending on if you're working digitally or not. And then once you factor all that stuff in, you have to be at least making whatever the minimum wage is in your area, right, when you're starting out, preferably more, depending on your skill level and your experience. So That's why I would say not less than 20 an hour, and factor in how much time it takes you to do one of those pieces. And you need to know that as well, because a lot of times they will ask you for a quote, and you need to be honest with yourself. You don't want to undercut yourself and say, oh, I'll do it for, $10 an hour, right? Just because you want that job. And then it ends up being this like 30-hour job, and you're not making that much money, and you're not able to do any personal work or any other freelance as well. So that's kind of how I approached it. Nowadays, I would encourage you guys to get on social media, any other message boards and forums where companies post up their work. I know that, I don't know if concept art is still around, it probably is. There's probably some other ones out there as well. And with social media, if you just keep posting up your work, you never know who's looking at the artwork out there, and you may get noticed by art directors, you may get noticed by just various blogs that post up your work and retweet your work. And then that's a good way to get noticed. And also, your fellow students, who knows where they end up, and it's a good way to network. And a lot of my freelances come from connections and friends who are in the industry as well, just through networking and being a nice person, meeting them at conventions. You go to different conventions, or if you do portfolio reviews, that's also a good way to network with people. Just treat people as people. Don't treat them as a mark or somebody who can get you a job, but just treat them as people and just be friends with them, and you just never know where those opportunities lead. A lot of opportunities will present themselves to you if you're just a nice person and you have skills that people can use. So that would be my advice to it. I mean, we could talk more if you're in my class or later on down the line, but there's so many variables, it's hard to give you just like a one answer fits everyone. So hopefully that helps, though, depending on where you're living at. I don't know if it did or not, but...
Cool. Well, we have about 5 minutes left. No more questions as of right now, but is there any last words you want to say or anything?
Yeah, thanks for coming out. Hopefully you guys learned something from this. I know it was pretty quick, but I encourage you guys to keep drawing and keep painting. Hopefully you will enroll in one of my classes or somebody else's classes, and we can talk more and I can answer more questions for you. Just make sure that you keep your passion for whatever career that you want. Keep your drive. The one thing that you can't learn from anyone else is your passion for working in this industry and creating the work that you want to create, and don't let anyone tell you what you should or shouldn't work on or what your style should be. Other than that, I would say there are many ways to get to the top of the mountain and to not get discouraged, and just keep your eye on the prize. I know those are all kind of little quotes that we hear a lot, but at the end of the day, I think it's important to remind yourself of that and not get discouraged. So, I think that's about it for me.
Yeah. One last question. This person's saying they got accepted to Vancouver Animation School.
Uh-huh.
Now they have to make a decision. If they go this route, it's 1 year for about $12,000 US, or they could make their own education at CGMA. They want to know the quality of Vancouver Animation School and any advice on that.
Honestly, I don't know much about the Vancouver Animation School. 12,000 is a lot, but it's not as much as I've seen. There are pros and cons. With CGMA and other online schools and YouTube videos and just self-directed study, it's great because we have the internet now and everything is at your fingertips. CGMA is good because you get direct feedback from the instructors. The downside of online schools and being by yourself is that you have to be a self-motivator, right? There's nobody there to crack the whip on you, and a lot of times there's no grades that force you to do the work. You just have to do the work on your own, and you have to have that drive on your own. With a school, it will give you that, but at the same time, you're spending $12,000, and if you don't know who the instructors are and what industry experience they have, you could be throwing that money out the door. The good thing about schools, both CGMA and online, is that you have the opportunity to network with other people. It's easier if it's face-to-face, but in a lot of ways you get a more diverse network if you're online because it's a global thing. you're not just restricted to that geographical area. Yeah, there's a lot of things to weigh. Like when I first started, we didn't have a lot of online stuff, and I chose not to go to a 4-year college to get my degree. I felt like I was enough of a self-motivator, and I had enough of the college experience that I could pretty much work on my own and direct myself towards what I needed. I would actually look at that school curriculum and see what the instructors' backgrounds are. Did they work in the industry? What were the projects they worked on? How long ago did they work on them? You don't want somebody who was in the industry like 12, 15 years ago, right? You want somebody who can, number one, communicate the ideas, and number two, has relevant work experience that they can impart to you. Because the industry changes so much, you want somebody who can give you that up-to-date information. But at the same time, if you're not a self-motivated learner, it's going to be really hard because you could just take the 12,000 and blow it on classes, but if you never do the work because you're too lazy or you play video games or whatever else, then you're just throwing your money away also. So I think everybody, it's a little different for them, and it's not an easy decision, but I think everybody has to ask themselves that question. And number one, can I learn on my own? Will I do all this work, or will I get distracted, and will I get frustrated and just not do it? Right? That's the bottom line. Because I think if you put in the work, you can learn anywhere. But if you're not willing to work on your own, or if you need that external drive, like grades or your parents, telling you have to go to class and get a degree, or if you have to, have this giant $12,000 loan over your head that drives you, then go with that. But you have to figure out what drives you. That would be my answer to that type of question.
Awesome. Well,
Yeah.
We're all out of time now. Thank you so much, Dzu. It was very informative. I learned a lot today too, and thank you so much
Awesome.
for everyone being here.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Yeah, you too.